if you're thinking that you have no idea what settings to use to capture those stunning senior photos that you see all over Instagram, all over Pinterest, and seemingly that every photographer except you is taking, you're in the right spot. I'm going to be telling you and breaking down the exact camera settings that I use for pretty much every single senior session and making it as easy as possible, taking all of the tech speak out of it and just getting to the root of what gets you great images. Hey there, photography friend, Sean Brown here, and I'm so excited that you're watching this video all about how to get the right settings to take those stunning senior portraits. If you're new to the channel, I am a high school senior photographer and educator, and I help photographers just like you not only take better photos, but build better businesses and get the freedom, flexibility, and time back in your life to do more of what you truly want to do. Now, in this video, what we're going to be covering are 5 essential settings that I am using for pretty much every single senior session. But if at any time you get lost, what I want you to do is to head into the video description down below, where we're going into some other details on how to take great photos. Now, all you got to do is grab our free 10 tips to taking better senior photos guide, and that'll allow you to know exactly what I'm doing beyond just the settings for making sure that your senior images turn out perfectly. So with this training, one of the things is if you get stuck or if anything's confusing at any point in this video, what I want you to do is to hit the pause button and go back and rewatch anything you need. This is not something that you're going to learn like automatically and then all of a sudden at your next session it's going to go perfectly. We're going to make it easy, but it's not something that automatically you're going to have memorized, and so it's natural to watch this video once, twice, 3 times if you need to watch it 10 times to get all of the info. That's totally okay. I remember the early stages of my photography business, and I would spend hours on YouTube literally Googling these very questions that you have. So the first thing that I want to note is that we're going to be talking about manual mode today. So when you pull out your camera, you're going to see a little dial on the top. This, for most cameras, is manual mode when it's set to M. Now, what manual mode is going to allow you to do is to have full control over your camera. So unlike auto or any of the other settings, your camera is going to pick and choose some of the settings for you, and we don't actually want that. We want to be in manual mode. You want to be in control of your camera. So that's the first thing that you're going to want to make sure that you do. The next thing is that you want to make sure that on your camera you're set to RAW. Now, RAW is a file type that allows you a little bit more flexibility when you go in to edit your images. They're larger files because they contain more data. So things like your shadows and your highlights, basically it means that if you mess up, you have a little bit more wiggle room to recover any blown pixels or underexposed areas. And it also makes sure that your edits are a little bit, we'll call it a little bit more fine-tunable. It allows you to edit in a different way that JPEG just does not. In fact, JPEG actually applies presets that maybe you don't really want, and we don't want that for your images because it might make your colors look how you don't want, it might make skin tones not look as good, and RAW is going to make sure that you're able to tweak and edit that as much as possible. The other thing that we're going to make sure to do, oh, and by the way, for RAW, we'll backtrack just a second. For RAW images, one of the things that I'll note is that in your camera settings, you're going to have multiple options. Typically, cameras are going to have like a large RAW option, medium, sometimes small. You're going to want to make sure that it's set to large. This makes sure that your resolution stays as big as possible. So when you print these beautiful wall portraits or put an image into a client album, it just makes sure that you have the most resolution to work with. If you do medium or small, your files are going to be smaller and they're not going to be as big. So for printing, it might lose some resolution and not look as good. So set it to large and make sure that it's set to RAW. That's all you got to know for now. The next thing that you're going to want to check is in manual mode. The next thing that you can control is your white balance. Now, if you've ever had an image and like the skin tones were like green or pink, or maybe it was like too orange or too blue in your photos, well, that means that your white balance wasn't set correctly. Now, a little like asterisk, a little caveat with white balance, you can adjust this in RAW. So guess what? If you don't get it perfectly, that's okay. In fact, one of the things that I often do in my post-production or my editing process is actually adjust the white balance. That's one of the things that I do tinker with quite a bit, simply because I want to make sure that it's perfect in my images. With white balance, this is really going to depend on where in the world you're photographing, what time of day you're photographing. And it's so funny because when I travel to speak at different conferences or travel for destination shoots with my own clients, I'm always like in awe of how we can be photographing the same time of day in a different part of the US, and my white balance is completely different than it would be than when I'm shooting here. That's simply just because of how the sun is hitting the atmosphere in that specific area. So as a general rule, daylight is going to be at 5,500 Kelvin. This is like noon daylight. So pretty much like anywhere in the world, you're going to set it to 5,500 Kelvin. So that's going to be like 5,500 K in your white balance menu. Now, the other thing that I'll note is typically when we get to the golden hour, the light, you actually need to change it. So now all of a sudden on my senior sessions, it's not uncommon that I'm at like 7,000 Kelvin. Now, for some of you guys in different parts of the US, that's going to be way too orange in your photos. So if your photos, you take it and you look at the back of the viewfinder and they're too orange, you want to lower your white balance. So too orange, bring your white balance down. If they're too blue, too cold is what we would call them, you're going to raise your white balance. When I'm setting the white balance, I'm always adjusting to make sure that my senior skin tone looks proper. So if they're too orange or too blue, I'm going to either increase or decrease my white balance to make sure that they're the perfect basically skin tone, and it's just going to make my editing job a lot easier. This is also the importance of using a reflector, because sometimes if you get into a situation where their skin tone's too green or too pink, well, this actually is not necessarily a camera setting. It's actually what your light is bouncing off. So especially if you're placing your clients in like a green grass field, like think of like the grass you would find on like a football or soccer field, then, and you have put your subject right there, well, your senior might have like really green skin tones, and that's not necessarily something you can correct with your camera settings. It's actually a lighting issue. So you're going to want to make sure that you use a reflector for that. The other thing too is the next set of settings is going to be basically what we would call the tripod, the camera 3 settings, which is your shutter speed, your aperture, and your ISO. We're going to start with the most important out of all of those settings. The most important setting that you're going to basically set and have all of your other settings around it affected by is your aperture. So the aperture controls 2 things. It first of all controls how much light is coming into your camera, and it also controls the depth of field. Basically, how blurry is the background of your image. So with this, one of the things that you'll notice is that with aperture numbers that are bigger, so like f16, f22, like those really big numbers, one of the things that that's going to do is that actually means it's a really small aperture. So it's kind of inverse. The bigger the number, the smaller the aperture opening. And so what that means is less light is coming into your camera. So for all of my senior sessions, for the most part, I'm going to shoot with an aperture of about f1.6 to f2.8. So if you've ever seen that like F on your camera, that means aperture. If you're like, what the F is this? Well, that's aperture. So with aperture, one of the things that this does is the lower the number, the blurrier the background. It also lets in more light. So this means that especially if you're photographing at sunset or into a little bit of like that blue hour where you have less light, it actually is going to be better for your camera settings because you're letting more of that light in. So for me, I'm photographing on prime lenses for the most part. So with that f1.6, it might not be possible with your lens. So I always recommend getting like a 50 millimeter or an 85 millimeter for your senior portraits. That's going to allow you to open up that lens. That's what we call it when we lower that aperture number and let more light in. The reason that I have it set at like f1.6 is because what it does is it blurs out the background of your images. So now your subjects have better, basically, isolation on them. You're able to see your subject and make sure that they're like the prime focus of your image. The big thing that I will say is be careful if you're a newer photographer and you haven't like perfected your focusing. This is going to impact it big because if it's too shallow of a depth of field, meaning that you're shooting with a very low aperture number, like 1.6, 2.0, 2.8, somewhere in there, that's going to make sure that your client might not be perfectly in focus. Now, if you have a new mirrorless camera with eye tracking and all that stuff, they do a pretty good job. So you can kind of get away with like f1.6. But if you're toying around with it, it's better to kind of bump up that aperture number and get a little bit more depth of field, basically making sure that your subject is fully in focus. Now with aperture, I'm going to set that. That's going to be the thing that I basically touch, and everything else around it is basically to get the perfectly exposed image. The reason why you set aperture first is because this is like my creative focus. So if I want a more blurred background or I want something more in focus, then I'm going to know what aperture to use. If I want a blurrier background, lower aperture number. If I want a more in focus background, like I want to capture the scenery around it, the higher the aperture number. With shutter speed, this is something that's really important. As a general rule, I do not fall below 1/400th of a second. The reason for that is because this is going to do a couple things. It's going to control how much light comes in, but it's also going to control your movement. So if you have a subject that's moving or walking or twirling in a dress, I want to make sure that that action is frozen. And so I typically am not going to fall below 1/400th of a second. This is also going to guarantee that no matter what lens you're using, you're never going to introduce any camera shake. So this is something that the lower the shutter speed, the slower it is, the more camera shake you can introduce. So 1/400th of a second is what I'm going to make sure that my camera shutter speed is set at a minimum. Now, if it's a brighter, sunnier day, that number is going to go up. So I might be shooting at like 1/2000th or 1/3200th or 1/4000th. Now, this just ensures that my camera settings aren't too much, that it's going to be an overexposed image. So that's something to keep in mind, is if your images are too bright, you're going to want to up your shutter speed. Now, if they're too dark, you want to bring your shutter speed down as close to 1/400th of a second as you can to make sure it's properly exposed. If it's too dark, then comes the next setting, which is your ISO. Your ISO controls basically the overall brightness of an image. Typically on a senior shoot, I'm going to be at like 100 ISO, maybe 200. And I try not to go above like ISO like 400 or so, simply because what's going to happen is the higher you push your ISO, the grainier and the more noisy that your images get. So it affects your overall image quality. With this said, one of the things is if it's too dark, you can bump up your ISO a little bit. I try not to go too high on my ISO. There have been times where I've been at like ISO 1000. That's even a little bit high for me. And I just make sure that it's super low as possible. So if your image is too dark, raise your ISO. That's after you basically set your shutter speed to the lowest that it possibly can go, not going past basically 1/400th of a second. If you need to go down to like 1/320th or 1/200th, that's typically okay. But I would try not to go there, and you just need to be more cognizant that you're not moving quickly, because then you can start to introduce some motion blur into your photos. As a general rule, for every single session that you see on my Instagram at Sean Brown Productions, that's my client side of the Instagram, what you'll see is most of my sessions are shot at 1.6 for the aperture. They're typically at like 1/400th to 1/800th in shutter speed. And then I'm just adjusting the ISO to make sure that my image is properly exposed. That's pretty much a simple breakdown of my exact camera settings. Play around with what works for you. I would highly recommend that you go out and test and you play around in different types of lighting conditions and figure out what works for you. But as a quick little Cliff Notes version, set your aperture for how much blur you want in your background. The lower the number, the more blur. Shutter speed, no less than 1/400th if you can, and your ISO is just there to adjust if you need your image brighter or basically darker. If it's too high, it'll be a brighter image. If it's too low, it'll be a darker image. So that's that for you. Again, grab my 10 tips to taking better senior portraits, where we go into exactly what to do to capture stunning portraits every single session. And as always, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button. We're going to be putting out videos every single week about all things senior photo education. So make sure, whether it's senior rep programs or tips on how to run a better business, well, that's what we've got here. And as always, we'll see you in the next video.